Honey does not spoil, at least not in the way most food does. Seal it away from moisture, and it can remain safe to eat for an extraordinarily long time. Decades, sometimes far longer, even though its color, texture, and flavor will still shift as it ages. That reputation for near permanence is the whole reason nobody thinks twice about leaving a jar of it in the cupboard indefinitely. There was a specific week on one narrow stretch of coastline above the Black Sea when that same permanence turned into something far more dangerous. A soldier could eat a spoonful of the local honey at midday and be lying in the road, unable to stand, before the afternoon was over. What was it about this one honey, from this one place, that let a scattering of mountain villagers do what an empire's legions could not? And why does the same chemistry still put people in hospital beds today? Honey earns its reputation for a simple chemical reason. It runs roughly 80% sugar and under 20% water, a combination so hostile to bacteria and mold that almost nothing can grow inside it. But preservation is not the same thing as safety. That same chemistry that keeps honey from spoiling does nothing to remove whatever else happens to be inside it. And in one particular kind of honey, what is inside it is the problem. A honeybee does not manufacture flavor out of nothing. It concentrates whatever nectar happens to be within flying range of the hive, sugar and all, and it does not filter out what does not belong. Along a narrow band of Anatolia's eastern Black Sea coast, and separately across the cliffs of the Himalayas, the dominant nectar source for a few weeks each spring is a rhododendron, chiefly Rhododendron ponticum and Rhododendron luteum, whose flowers carry a family of natural toxins called grayanotoxins. Whatever concentration is sitting in that particular flower that particular week ends up unfiltered in the honey. Grayanotoxins attach to sodium channels in nerve and muscle cells and hold them open, blocking the reset that normally lets a cell fire again. In a human body, that produces dizziness, vomiting, a heart rate that drops instead of races, and blood pressure that collapses instead of climbs. A poisoning that looks, to anyone watching from the outside, exactly like violent drunkenness. Severity tends to rise with how much a person eats, but toxicologists studying this honey stress that dose is genuinely hard to predict, because grayanotoxin concentration swings widely from one batch to the next, depending on the season and exactly which flowers the bees favored that week. 2 spoonfuls from 2 different jars can carry 2 very different doses. The Stanford historian Adrienne Mayor, who has spent decades cataloging the ancient world's biological and chemical weapons, points out that almost nothing else in nature offers quite this combination. A toxin that disables rather than reliably kills, hidden inside a food a hungry stranger will eat without being told to, preserved indefinitely by the very sugar chemistry that keeps ordinary honey safe for millennia. Once it is sealed into wax comb, this honey needs no refrigeration, no chemist, and no delivery system. It only needs someone hungry enough not to ask why it was left exactly where they would find it. Roughly 3 centuries before Rome ever marched through this region, 10,000 Greek soldiers under a young officer named Xenophon had already found out exactly what that honey could do. In the year 401 BC, this mercenary army, later remembered as the 10,000, was retreating north through hostile territory, trying to reach the Black Sea after a failed campaign deep inside Persia. Marching through Colchian territory, close to the Greek colony of Trapezus, the exhausted men found wild honeycombs thick along the hillside and helped themselves. Xenophon, one of the army's own commanders, wrote down what happened next in his account of the march, the Anabasis. Soldiers who had eaten only a little of the honeycomb acted, in his description, like men extremely drunk. Those who had eaten a great deal collapsed, vomiting and purging, unable to stand, looking to the men around them like the dying. By nightfall, entire units lay on the open ground, as though the army had just lost a battle. No one had actually died. Within a day, the worst symptoms passed. Within 3 or 4 days, the army was marching again, as if nothing had happened. Nothing in Xenophon's account suggests anyone had planned this. There is no ambush here, no enemy hiding in the trees, only an army of hungry strangers eating the first abundant food they found, in a landscape whose plants gave them no reason for suspicion. That absence of malice is exactly what makes the account so useful to later readers. It is the control case, proof of what this honey does to an unprepared army on its own, decades before anyone thought to put it to deliberate use. By the time Rome entered this same stretch of coastline, the stakes were no longer a tired army looking for its next meal. They were the survival of an entire kingdom. For nearly 3 decades, on and off, Rome had been fighting to break Mithridates VI of Pontus, a ruler who had reportedly turned poison into a personal discipline, dosing himself for years with sublethal amounts of various toxins to build tolerance against assassination. The long conflict historians call the Third Mithridatic War had gone badly for him. He had already lost the bulk of his kingdom's cities, his fleet, and most of the armies he had spent decades assembling. By the middle of the 60s BC, under the command of the Roman general Pompey, legions had pushed Mithridates out of his own kingdom entirely, forcing him northeast into the mountain country between Pontus and Colchis, with fewer soldiers, fewer supplies, and fewer allies with every month that passed. Mithridates could not beat Pompey's legions in open battle. Almost no one in that era could. Rome's advantage was never clever tactics. It was scale, discipline, and years of unbroken campaign experience against exactly this kind of enemy. What Mithridates still had were allies who knew terrain Rome did not. Mountain communities like the Heptakometes, tree-dwelling hill people who had lived in this exact stretch of forest for generations, and now found Roman columns marching straight through it. The Heptakometes were not professional soldiers. Ancient writers describe them ambushing travelers by dropping down on them from the trees, living on foraged meat and whatever the forest provided. They had no way to meet a Roman cohort shield to shield. What they did have, growing wild across hillsides that had already poisoned an entire Greek army 3 centuries earlier, was the same plant in the same forest. And unlike the Romans now entering this territory for the first time, they knew this local honey could be dangerous. That was knowledge the advancing Romans plainly did not share. Somewhere around 65 BC, along a route that cut straight through Heptakometes' territory, a column from Pompey's army came marching through the mountains and found vessels of honey waiting for them beside the road, with no one in sight to claim them. Strabo, the geographer who recorded the episode, says the Heptakometes destroyed 3 maniples of Pompey's force that day, a Roman unit whose exact size is disputed among translators of his text, ranging anywhere from a few hundred men to well over 1,000, depending on how the term is read. To soldiers who had been living on campaign rations for weeks, abandoned food along a supply route was not automatically suspicious. Foraging from captured or deserted stores was ordinary practice deep in hostile territory, where formal supply lines rarely reached this far. To men who had never set foot in this region before, the honey left along the road looked like exactly what they wanted it to be. Supplies an enemy had abandoned in a hurry. It was not a hurried mistake. The region was thick with Rhododendron ponticum and Rhododendron luteum, the 2 plants most capable of producing grana-toxin-laced honey, and the Heptakometes, who lived among them year-round, understood the risk in a way outsiders did not. According to Strabo's account, they gathered unusually large quantities of the toxic honey, set it directly along the Roman route, and withdrew to wait. The soldiers ate. Within a short time, according to the surviving account, they were vomiting, purging, and unable to stand upright, collapsing in the road in numbers large enough that the scene looked like the aftermath of a lost battle rather than an army on the march. In the more severe cases, men appeared close to death from the sheer drop in blood pressure and heart rate the toxin produces. Whatever fighting capacity those men had carried an hour earlier had simply stopped existing. The Heptakometes returned and cut them down where they lay. Strabo describes the Heptakometes using the language ancient writers reserved for people they considered barely civilized, utterly savage, living like animals in trees. It is worth noticing that the plan those supposedly savage hill dwellers carried out required more botanical precision, more patience, and more coordinated timing than anything conventional Roman tactics called for that particular week. The classicist Adrienne Mayor, weighing Strabo's account against what is known of Roman unit sizes, estimates Roman losses at somewhere around 1,000 men. A working formation destroyed without Rome ever getting to use a single weapon of its own. What makes this episode more than a single grim anecdote is how little it actually required to work. No metallurgy, no chemistry, no standing army of its own. Only patience, local knowledge of a dangerous plant, and enough of it gathered in one place. That combination is precisely what has kept this specific ambush alive in military and medical literature for 2,000 years, cited again and again by historians of ancient warfare and, as recently as 2023, by physicians at a United States Army Medical Center, studying it as a case in what an unfamiliar environment can do to a disciplined force, before a single blade is ever drawn. Modern case reports give some sense of how little of this specific honey it can take. In some documented poisonings, as little as a tablespoon or two from a strong batch was enough to drop a grown adult's heart rate far enough to require a hospital's help. Though because potency varies so sharply between batches, that amount is nowhere close to a reliable threshold. 1,000 dead soldiers is a number. What it actually meant, on Mayor's reading, was a meaningful share of everything Pompey had brought into these mountains, gone in a single afternoon, without Rome managing to land a blow of its own. That is the macro cost, and it depends on how confidently one reads Strabo's word for the unit involved. The ancient record itself commits only to 3 maniples destroyed, not to a body count. The individual cost is harder to reconstruct at this distance, but it did not disappear once the ambush itself passed into history. This honey never became a controlled substance, a weapon locked away once its danger was understood. It stayed exactly what it had always been, a wild food growing on an open hillside that anyone could still gather. In the Kachkar Mountains above Trabzon, not far from where Pompey's men once fell, a beekeeper named Hasan Kutluata still harvests this same honey today, known locally as delibal, working hives set among the same purple rhododendron. He has told journalists that local beekeepers grade this honey by something they call its promille value, a traditional measure of strength and quality passed down through the trade rather than a laboratory reading. But in practice, the stronger that grading, the smaller the dose it takes to affect someone. For a family that has worked this specific honey for generations, getting that judgment right is not folklore. It is the difference between a spoonful sold as medicine and a spoonful that puts a customer in an emergency room. That risk is not hypothetical. The toxicologists Sibel Silici and Ali Timuçin Atayoglu, reviewing the published medical literature, counted well over 1,000 documented poisonings from this exact honey, most from Turkey's Black Sea provinces, arriving in hospitals with the same dropped heart rate and collapsed blood pressure that put Roman soldiers on the ground 2,000 years earlier. Rome did not defeat the Heptakometes trick with a cleverer trick of its own. It defeated it simply by staying long enough to stop being strangers. By 63 BC, Mithridates was dead, not cornered by Pompey directly, but run down by his own history. Driven out of Pontus and pushed all the way to the Crimea, he was planning one last campaign against Rome when his own son led a revolt against him. Besieged in his own citadel, with nowhere left to retreat, he took his own life. Pompey, meanwhile, spent that same period consolidating Rome's hold over what Mithridates had left behind, incorporating much of Pontus directly into a Roman province alongside neighboring Bithynia, while leaving other parts of the wider region under local client rulers, loyal to Rome. What that consolidation slowly erased was not the rhododendron and not the honey. It erased the gap between what the Heptakometes knew about their own forest and what Rome knew. Roman administrators, traders, and settlers now lived in this territory instead of marching blind through it. The completion of that shift is easy to date. Around 77 AD, roughly 140 years after the ambush, the encyclopedist Pliny the Elder sat down in Rome to catalog everything the empire knew about the natural world, and gave this specific honey its own entry and its own Latin name: Melanomenon, maddening honey. What had once been a weapon capable of erasing a working Roman formation in an afternoon had become, to the empire that lost those men, a documented regional curiosity, filed alongside entries on bees, wax, and the varying qualities of honey by province. This stands as one of the earliest and best documented cases in the historical record of a natural toxin deliberately deployed as a weapon against an organized army. Not the first act of chemical or biological warfare in antiquity, since poisoned wells, tainted meat, and disease-laced gifts all have their own much older history, but one of the clearest cases where the ancient evidence lines up precisely with what modern toxicology confirms actually happened. Adrienne Mayor's own survey of ancient chemical and biological warfare returns to it repeatedly as one of the sharpest examples of the pattern the book traces. 2,000 years after Strabo first wrote it down, the region itself never stopped being known for the same plant and the same danger. Through Pliny's encyclopedia, through Ottoman-era travelers' accounts of a strange, bitter honey along the Black Sea coast, and into guidebooks written this year. The echo today runs in two directions at once. Across the eastern Black Sea provinces of Turkey, families like the Kutluatas still harvest deli bal as a living trade, sold at a real premium over ordinary honey, and used, much as it was centuries ago, as folk medicine for blood pressure and as a mild recreational buzz. A trade serving a market of buyers who, like Pompey's soldiers, generally have no inherited knowledge of how much is too much. Well over 4,000 kilometers east, in the high valleys of Nepal, Gurum honey hunters climb handmade rope ladders hundreds of feet up sheer cliff faces twice a year to cut the same toxic honey from the combs of Apis laboriosa, the largest honeybee species on Earth. That tradition developed entirely on its own, with no connection to anything that happened in Pontus. And today, it feeds the very same global market, packaged and shipped to buyers on the other side of the planet, who have never seen a rhododendron in bloom. And 2,000 years on, an army that once had no idea this honey existed now trains its own physicians to recognize it on sight. In 2023, a physician at Madigan Army Medical Center in the United States published a clinical paper walking through the entire ancient episode in careful medical detail, concluding that mad honey still counts as a live environmental threat that any physician deployed near the Black Sea should be prepared to recognize. Information doing, deliberately and slowly, the job that no shield ever could. That jar of honey, sealed and sitting in a cupboard somewhere right now, will still be safe to eat years from now, more or less exactly as honey has always kept. Nothing about honey itself has changed since the first bee ever visited the first rhododendron flower on that particular hillside above the Black Sea. What changed was who understood it and when. For generations, a handful of mountain communities carried a piece of knowledge that an empire did not have. And for one specific afternoon in the mountains above Colchis, that gap was worth more than every legion Rome could put on the road. The jar in most kitchens today is almost certainly safe, blended from 100 different flowers, the way most commercial honey has been for a century. Nowhere near a rhododendron forest. But the next time a spoon goes into it, it is worth remembering that on one specific stretch of coastline, honey this ordinary still means something very close to what it meant the day it stopped a Roman army in its tracks. Proof that even the gentlest food kept in the house has, in exactly the right place, never entirely stopped being capable of the opposite.